Does it feel like you're having the same argument over and over and over again? The content changes, but the flavor of the argument stays the same. If so, you are not alone. This is one of the most common relationship traps. So let's talk about why this happens and how to break out of it. Hey there, I'm Lauren Consul, a licensed marriage and family therapist and certified sex therapist, here to help you create more satisfying and secure sex and relationships. Now, the most common relationship pattern is the pursue-withdraw dynamic, also called the anxious avoidant dance. Now, every relationship falls into certain cycles and patterns where the content of the argument changes, but the pattern stays the same. So you might be arguing about the dog or the dishes or being late to dinner, but there's a familiar rhythm to these fights. And this happens because the real underlying issue isn't being addressed. So the pattern repeats and will continue to repeat until you address the underlying issues. And when we're talking about underlying issues, we're talking about the deeper, more vulnerable stuff that's going on. And this is one of the biggest things that I work with partners on in therapy. Instead of focusing on the argument of the week, getting stuck in what I call the content of you did this, no, you did that, this happened, no, this happened. We take a step back and connect it to a larger pattern to uncover the deeper feelings that are really, truly driving the conflict, because that is what actually helps them break free from the cycle. Because when you're actually addressing the underlying issues, then you can break out and move forward. And if you're not addressing those underlying issues, you're gonna get stuck. So how do you actually do this? First, you need to understand the cycle that you get stuck in so you can break out of it. So I want to share a cycle that I came up with and adapted from Scott Woolley's original model. And we're going to talk through this to help you understand the cycle that you might be getting into so you can break free from it. Now, first, we want to look at the fact that we all have different wounds, hurts, and past trauma that are going to impact us and trigger us differently. What triggers me will be different from what triggers you or your partner. So essentially, we're all existing in our relationships with these potential triggers, these old hurts, all the stuff that we're carrying around. Then something happens between you and your partner that triggers a perceived loss of connection with your partner. Now, what exactly triggers you is going to be different based on your past experiences. And this is really important because your partner, as your primary attachment figure, is a symbol of safety. When you are connected with them, you feel safe. That's the basis of attachment, knowing that you have each other's back, that if I go out, you're gonna watch my back, I'm gonna watch yours. We are working together as a team. Now, in those moments of connection and safety, you're in what I call couple preservation, where you're protecting the couple, you're protecting each other, you're working together. However, when something you perceive as threatening happens, your partner no longer is perceived as safe, and you go into individual preservation. Essentially, your brain is saying, okay, we have to keep ourselves safe, because again, your brain's job is to keep you alive, not happy. So it says we have to keep ourselves safe. Since that partner is no longer safe, we need to protect ourselves. Now, this isn't usually a physical threat. Of course it can be, but it's often more an emotional threat that we're perceiving this loss of connection, this loss of safety. Because your brain interprets a physical and emotional threat similarly because they are both tied to survival. Again, that attachment, I'm more likely to survive if I'm connected to you. Once I'm not connected to you, I'm no longer safe, even if I'm not physically threatened by you. When you move to individual preservation, you have a physiological response. The prefrontal cortex, this part of your brain that's responsible for logic and rational thinking, shuts down, and the blood from this prefrontal cortex goes to your amygdala, which controls your fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. That's what really takes over. And this, again, is because your brain is trying to keep you alive. So we don't need this higher level logical, rational thinking at this moment. We need survival. We need to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn in order to survive and get through this. And this is why conflict or disconnection with your partner can feel so painful, because your brain is fighting for your life in those moments. Going back to the cycle, when you perceive a threat from your partner, what's happening is it's tapping into an attachment wound, something that's deeply personal and usually unconscious, something that you are wanting, needing based on your attachment style, which I'm not going to go into attachment styles in this video. That's a whole nother video, but knowing your attachment style is important in understanding this cycle. In that moment, if you're not feeling safe enough to share with your partner vulnerably that, hey, that is making me feel unsafe, unloved, insecure, those deeper emotional feelings that are connected to those attachment wounds, you will quickly shift into that self-protection, individual preservation. I like to think of it like a dog. When it feels safe, it's gonna roll over and expose its belly, showing its most vulnerable side. That's this middle part of this cycle because you're sharing deeply and vulnerably. But if you're feeling threatened, if you're not feeling safe, that dog's gonna stand up on all fours, tail erect, growling with its teeth bared. That's that fight or flight response. So the ultimate goal is to stay in this middle part of this cycle where you get out of the cycle, you're just staying in the vulnerability. But if you haven't had a pattern in your life or in this relationship where it's safe to do that, or you haven't created that safety, you're gonna get pulled into the cycle because it's safer. Now it's safer because you're not sharing those vulnerable parts of yourself, so you're less likely to get hurt in that. Right? We know that actually isn't true because when we get into the cycle, we still end up getting hurt, but like that is that moment, what our brain is trying to do. If you aren't able to stay in that middle part of the cycle where you're able to share vulnerably, you get pulled into the cycle. So let's understand what that actually looks like. The first thing that happens is you are expressing secondary emotions to your partner. These are safer emotions, usually related to anger or frustration or really any emotion that isn't as vulnerable, not talking about the deeper stuff that's actually happening. Then you start to tell yourself a story that reinforces core negative beliefs about yourself, others, and the world. Things like, I'm not good enough, or everyone leaves, or people are too needy. And these core beliefs are connected to your attachment style, which is why it's really important to understand your attachment style and messages that you implicitly and explicitly learned in early childhood that were reinforced over time. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you are consciously telling yourself these stories. Many times it is, but these are also unconsciously being reinforced in these moments. And then because of this, you engage in coping behaviors. And these are the adaptive strategies that you learn to cope through childhood or perhaps another significant relationship. And again, these are related to your attachment style, what those adaptive strategies are, what those coping behaviors are. Now, if you have more of an anxious attachment style, you might pursue your partner by criticizing, getting loud, or trying to provoke a reaction just to get a sense that they are still in it with you. Just let me know that you're here. Again, because you're not talking about the deeper vulnerable stuff like, hey, I'm feeling insecure, I'm feeling alone or abandoned. So you're trying to get something from them, even if it's by them reacting to you. So you're going to use any strategy you have, which might be criticizing or following or provoking them in some way. Now, if you have more of an avoidant attachment style, you are more likely to withdraw. This might be shutting down, leaving, disassociating, trying to do anything to get away from the big emotion because that feels too scary, too overwhelming. You just want to be able to take care of it yourself because that's what you learn to do. Internalize, push that down, deal with it on your own. So you're going to go to strategies that are going to try and help shut this down. The problem is that your coping behavior then tends to trigger your partner, which launches them into their own cycle, which then triggers you, and around and around and around you guys can go. Now, this pattern can be really highlighted by that anxious, avoidant attachment style that I was talking about earlier. The anxious partner craving reassurance leans in, really wanting to connect by any means possible to feel secure and get reassurance that their partner is still in it with them. But what this ends up doing usually is overwhelming the avoidant partner, who will start to pull away from the emotional intensity because it's too scary, it's too much. The more the anxious partner leans in, the more the avoidant partner leans out, which only increases the anxious partner's need for reassurance and the avoidant partner's need to retreat. So you can see how deep this cycle can go. Understanding your cycle is really important, and it can be really helpful to actually chart it out. What happens in these moments? How does it trigger my partner? What happens for me? So you guys can better understand your cycle, because the better you can understand your cycle, the more you're able to call it out and try and pull yourselves out of it, because that's the ultimate goal, is to break out of the cycle and stay in that middle part with the vulnerability and being able to hear and be present for each other in that vulnerability. So that first step is really understanding your cycle and the role each of you plays in it, what it's connected to on a deeper level, and being able to communicate about that. And this is going to take time, because this pattern and the underlying issues and feelings began long before you two met. It's just been reinforced by your relationship cycle. The beautiful thing about attachment, though, is because it starts in relationships, it can really be healed well in relationships, in the right relationships. If you guys are able to both work on this relationship cycle and this pattern together, you can have what's called earned secure attachment. So it's not a red flag that you guys have different attachment styles or that you guys are in the cycle or push each other. The red flag would be if you guys aren't addressing it. Now, being able to recognize that you guys have this pattern and working on it is really important. Initially, you're gonna start with catching the cycle after the fact. So after you get into it, when you guys are more regulated, coming back to each other and going, oh crap, we were in that cycle. Let's, in this calmer moment, go into that vulnerable space. And then with some of that practice over time, you'll start to try and catch it during the conflict. And usually it might be at the end at first, and then we're gonna try and move it to the middle and then towards the beginning. And your goal is to try and catch it earlier and earlier. That is your relationship cycle. Can you recognize yourself and your partner in the cycle? Let me know what questions you have in the comments below, what you want to know more about, and be sure to follow along if you want more content on how to have more satisfying and secure sex and relationships.